This video is so getting demonetized. Hi, my name is Sydney. Welcome back to my channel. So yeah, transgender athletes. It's been a pretty reoccurring topic and I keep seeing it everywhere. So we're gonna talk about it because why not? I came upon this video by the Daily Signal in the last number of days that basically talks to a track athlete and her experience competing against transgender athletes.
When I'm at the start of the race, when I'm lining up and getting into my blocks, everyone already knows the outcome. Those two athletes are going to come 1 and 2, and everyone knows it.
The Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference, the CIAC, says that athletes can choose to compete for the sport in which they gender identify with.
No one thinks it's fair because we all know that males are physically stronger than females and they compete at a higher level.
Petitions are circulating in Plainville and Glastonbury after 2 trans girls swept the competition at the state track and field championships.
From third on, it's a little different. We're actually fighting for those spots, but in those meets, there's no way that one of us biological girls will be able to outrun those transgender athletes.
This is now becoming an issue that is going to keep reoccurring because as people strive for greater diversity, more tolerance, and the acceptance of the transgender movement and transgender individuals, this is not going to stop anytime soon. I mean, I think at this point, diversity is more synonymous with if you don't accept the thing, then we'll come for you. Here's a clip of the transgender teen athletes that we're talking about.
Dominating the competition at the Girls Track and Field Championships in Connecticut earlier this month.
This is so rough.
The rule states that students are entitled to participate on a team based on their gender identity, how they identify.
Now, the internet really likes to talk about transgender athletes like Fallon Fox, the MMA fighter, and Mary Gregory, a transgender weightlifter who recently broke 4 world records in women's weightlifting. So the question here is, do these transgender individuals have an unfair advantage over biological women? And if so, is that then ruining women's sport in this quest for inclusivity? Probably. I mean, the core reason why women and men don't compete against each other as it is because men have a biological advantage physically over their female counterparts. Not always, but usually. And that just comes from the big bad B word. Biology. Men generally have greater bone density, bigger muscles. Women generally carry more fat, and we generally have a reduced oxygen carrying capacity. Which kind of doesn't make sense when you think about it because we do so much talking. And let's remember, men on average are taller and heavier than their female counterparts. Now, I'm not a scientist. I do not claim to be a scientist, and some of the information that relates to what I'm about to say is like German. Loud and confusing. One study that I found noted, differences in similarly trained male and female distance runners are largely due to body fat percentage, less cardiorespiratory fitness, and least to running economy. A 1985 study determined that men and women who are capable of similar performances, in this case a 15-mile race, do not differ in body composition, cardiorespiratory response, or metabolic response. So basically, as far as I understand this, when it comes to runners, and let me just say here that athleticism does differ depending on sport, the closer that men and women are in terms of body composition, the way that their heart and lungs work, and their metabolic response, the more similarly they perform. I think. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I'm pretty sure that's right. So basically, if you believe science prior to the 2000s, most of us would agree that men and women are just biologically, physically different. Except feminists and identity politics people. They hate that idea.
The idea that the body is either male or female is totally wrong.
Yikes. Naturally, the people who are in support of transgender athletes like to argue that, well, none of this is a problem and that transgender athletes don't even actually perform any better than biological women. In fact, that seems to be the basis for their entire argument, that genetic makeup has very little to do with this, and more than anything, it comes down to hormones and their effect on the body. I love an inconsistent argument. So because a lot of these studies like to talk about runners for some reason, we're going to talk about runners. One main study that the left likes to cite comes from the Journal of Sporting Cultures and Identities. This study concluded that as testosterone levels approach female norms, trans women experience a decrease in muscle mass, bone density, and other physical characteristics. So, in short, when it comes to runners, specifically, the longer that someone is taking estrogen and blocking androgens, the less testosterone they have in their body and they lose their competitive edge. Therefore, the argument here is, over time, trans women will eventually approach the performance levels of biological women. Similar being the operative word. The researcher in this particular study argues that after a year of hormone therapy, for example, female trans distance runners completely lose their speed advantage over cisgender women. Yeah, I'll bet they do. I guess there's a few issues with this study. The first thing being that they did not look at enough people. They looked at 8. The study also only looks at runners who we know perform differently to people in other areas of sport. They also perform differently to those of us who don't do sports. Like me. I hate running. But this seems to be a pretty common problem with most research in this area. The sample sizes are too small, the studies don't run for long enough, and really, endocrinology, which is the study of hormones, isn't really all that clear-cut. A couple months ago, I reached out to the director of the Department of Endocrinology at Austin Health, which is a hospital in Melbourne, and he told me that there's just very little research into this topic, and much of what there is based on opinion. I don't know though, isn't like everything the left does based on opinion? I found another compilation of data that also talks about this. The performance-enhancing effects of testosterone supplementation have been well documented, but our understanding of how androgen deprivation and estrogen supplementation affect performance is less well understood. It references a 2004 study that basically looks at androgen deprivation and estrogen supplementation on muscle mass. It looked at 2 groups of transgender individuals, male to female and female to male, and concluded that after 1 year of hormone therapy, the male to female group had a significant decline in their thigh muscle mass. The researchers also noted that, even after a year, the male to female group still had a significantly larger muscle mass when compared to the female to male group. 3 years on, the researchers recorded no additional changes. I just want to highlight here that this study was not undertaken on athletes and was actually conducted on just everyday transgender individuals. The researchers didn't directly measure any physical components of athleticism such as strength, speed, explosiveness, or endurance. So basically, in line with what the other study said, male to female transgenders saw their muscle mass shrink after a year on hormones. However, after 3 years, there really wasn't that much more of a noticeable decline. Their muscle was still significantly larger than the female to male transgenders who they were being compared against. Those women, just by the way, probably would have been taking testosterone, because that's how transitioning works now. So let me try to put all this together. If you're taking estrogen and blocking androgens for a year, your muscle mass will decrease. If you are already a male with a similar body composition, cardiorespiratory response, and metabolic response, then you probably won't perform that differently to your female counterparts. But if you weren't similar in these ways, even being on hormones, there's still a likelihood that you'll perform differently. That's the best I can summarize. Please don't yell at me in the comments, I'm not a biologist. A really interesting case study here is caster Semenya. She is a gold medalist runner from South Africa. She's also intersex and as a result has higher than usual testosterone levels, meaning that she recently has made the media. The Court of Arbitration for Sport decided last week to uphold the IAAF rule that would require Semenya to take testosterone suppressants to compete in the women's division in her best events, the 100-meter and the 1500-meter races. This is not an isolated incident either. In fact, there have been other runners who have also been dropped from their teams because they too had higher than normal testosterone levels. The reality is that although testosterone plays a role in elite performance, the details of the science get murky very quickly. Athletes with the highest testosterone are not always the winners. Ones with lower levels can also take home gold. I mean, yeah, they may not always be the winner, but there's this sort of overarching accepted opinion that testosterone, at least in some ways, gives competitors a competitive edge. If it didn't give them a competitive edge, then people wouldn't dope and that wouldn't be frowned upon in sports. And again, if it didn't, then there wouldn't be a requirement for women with naturally high testosterone levels to take suppressants. So yeah, There's that. Now, besides hormones, people who are pro-trans athletes tend to argue that physical advantages don't matter. I bet they'd change their tune pretty quick if they had to box someone who was like 100 kilos heavier. We don't disqualify Michael Phelps for having super long arms. That's just a competitive advantage he has in his sport. We don't regulate height in the NBA. Being tall is just an advantage for a center. For as long as sports have been around, there have been people who have had advantages over others. A universal level playing field does not exist. This is true. A universal level playing field does not exist. Until we complete the cloning process. Personally, I don't think this is smart or accurate. Most sporting institutions do their best to mitigate factors that they think would give some competitors an unfair advantage over others, which is why a lot of sports have things like weight divisions and so on. And really, when you have competitors competing against the same sex, structural advantages only go so far. I mean, look at me, I'm a prime example. I'm like 1,000 feet tall and little goblin people tend to just run faster. It's horrifying. I did find something that I think summarizes this topic very well. The decision to restrict male to female transsexual athletes from competing in a given sport as females rests on two critical assumptions. The first is that most people exposed to testosterone from puberty onward will develop physical and/or physiological attributes that contribute to a distinct performance advantage over most women. Although the performance boundaries between male and female athletes have narrowed in the past several decades, there are distinct gender differences that exist on average. The second assumption needed to justify restricting male to female transsexual participation in female events is that these attributes can withstand the hormonal manipulation of sex reassignment, thereby giving the male to female transsexual athlete an unfair competitive advantage. Certainly, there are some effects of testosterone that cannot be reversed, including, most notably, its effect on post-pubertal height in men. Men are, on average, taller than women, with the pubertal growth spurt accounting for most of the gender difference. This gender discrepancy in height might itself be construed as offering an unfair performance advantage to male to female transsexual athletes who participate in sports for which height is thought to be an asset, such as volleyball, basketball, and netball. To be clear, no amount of hormone therapy can change structural differences in people such as height. In my opinion, the saddest part about all of this is that it seems like no one really wins. What you basically have is a situation where hostility towards transgender athletes is just growing day by day, and women who exist in these sports are feeling marginalized and angry because they don't feel that they're actually competing in a fair way. What's really sad to me about a lot of this is that people are called transphobic, they're forced to shut up, when really they're just actually expressing pretty valid concerns. Diversity and tolerance for all, unless of course you're on the right wing, in which case there's no tolerance for you. A lot of this type of stuff is normalized because people eventually stop speaking up because they really don't want to get abused for saying something that goes against this inclusion for all narrative. But I think in this case, it's just a little bit naive to suggest that there's no possibility of any marked differences between biological women and transgender female athletes, because there are, and there can be. Especially when you have people like Fallon Fox and Mary Gregory who are competing in sports against women. So in the end, there are a lot of different elements that go into athleticism. And there are a lot of things that determine how well or how badly you perform as an elite athlete. On the high school level, it seems like there are very few restrictions and requirements that might protect biological female athletes from competing against transgender athletes. And in that case, I definitely think it's fair to ask, how fair is this? Full disclosure, I went into this video thinking that trans female athletes shouldn't be competing against biological women, and I still believe that, but for different reasons now. For starters, there are far too many variables that might determine how someone performs in a sport. There are already so many natural variables when it comes to people of the same sex competing against each other, but when you have transgender athletes in the mix, there's even more variables. In my opinion, at least, that makes all of this very hard to measure, which brings me to the second reason I still think what I think. And that is, there's just not enough empirical evidence on this topic. As far as I can see, and from the things that these researchers and doctors have told me, there isn't enough research into this that would tell us definitively whether transgender athletes should and can compete. It's a little bit like giving a patient a cancer drug and being totally unsure of how it performs, but giving it to them anyway, regardless if it might kill them. I've said this before in other videos, and I freely admit, people come in all different shapes and sizes, which means that they perform differently in different events and areas and running up hills and whatever else it is that athletic people do. But when it comes to sports, there is this drive to create a level playing field because, at the end of the day, men and women just operate differently. And that's a fact. An inconvenient fact for the left, but a fact nevertheless. Lastly, I really don't feel like there are enough protections for female athletes when it comes to all of this, despite the fact that you have the Olympics and other elite organizations trying their best to regulate and put restrictions on people doing particular things and performing in particular ways. That being said, I do think we're getting to a point where feelings in this case are dictating way more than the terrible science that's on the table, and just general rules and regulations that you would logically put in place. So that all being said, I think until there's more evidence, more data, more protections in place for biologically female athletes, and less feelings dictating the situation, this is a no from me. So what do you guys think? Do you think that transgender female athletes should be allowed to compete against biological women? Do you think that all of this is totally insane? Or do you think that we need a little bit more evidence before we can decide either way? As always, if you like the video, hit subscribe and the thumbs up button. If you want to leave a comment, feel free to do so. Just be respectful about it. And I will see you guys next time.